The air was sharp that morning, so sharp that every breath seemed to slice the lungs like tiny pieces of glass. The frost clung to the windows in pale white flowers, and the ground outside the house was still hard with the night's ice. It was Thanksgiving, a day that should have felt warm, a day that should have smelled of roasted turkey, cinnamon pies, and laughter. But for me, there was a heaviness sitting on my chest. I watched from the kitchen doorway as my daughter-in-law hurried around the kitchen, pulling golden brown dishes from the oven. The table was set with perfect care. Candles flickered, the silverware gleamed. My son, his wife, and their friends laughed and joked loudly, glasses of wine already in their hands, though the sun had barely climbed above the horizon. And then there was my grandson. 8 years old, small for his age, with hair that curled stubbornly no matter how often his mother tried to tame it. He stood by the back door, clutching his thin jacket. "Out!" his mother said sharply, not even looking at him. He blinked. "Bit, it's cold, Mom. Can I stay inside until dinner?" "You should have thought about that, before breaking your sister's snow globe," she snapped, her voice tight with irritation. "You need to learn respect." "I didn't mean to. It was an accident." Her hand was already on the doorknob. She pushed it open and pointed to the porch. The wind howled through the crack. "You sit out there until I say you can come in. Maybe then you'll think before you touch things that don't belong to you." He, my son, his father, didn't say a word. He just sipped his drink and looked away. I stepped forward. "He's a child," I said, my voice low but firm. "You can't just put him outside in this weather. It's below freezing." My daughter-in-law shot me a look that could have frozen the sun itself. "Dad, please. Don't start. We all agreed he needs to learn discipline." I looked to my son for support, but he kept his eyes on his plate as though the turkey needed his full attention. So they sent him outside. I stood by the window and watched as my grandson curled himself on the porch steps, hugging his knees. His breath puffed out in little white clouds. His thin jacket was no match for the icy air. Inside, the family laughed. They passed around steaming dishes of mashed potatoes, warm rolls, gravy so thick it clung to the ladle. They talked about football, about sales, about vacations they were planning. And there I stood, with my hand on the glass, feeling each minute stretch like a blade. I couldn't eat. I couldn't laugh. I couldn't stop staring at that little boy, his shoulders shaking with cold. At one point, he looked up and met my eyes through the glass. There was no anger there, no resentment. Just a quiet, confused hurt, as though he couldn't understand why his own family had left him out there. And something inside me broke. I slipped out to the back door when no one was looking and knelt beside him. "Here?" I whispered, wrapping my scarf around his neck. "Just a little longer, my boy. I'll make sure you're warm soon." His small hands clutched mine. "Why do they hate me, Grandpa?" he asked in a voice that made my throat tighten. "They don't hate you," I lied softly, brushing the frost from his hair. "They just don't understand. But I do, and I won't let this happen again." Inside, they called my name. The turkey was being served. But I stayed with him until his shivers eased, until his breathing slowed. I carried that moment with me back to the table, and as I sat down, the food on my plate tasted like sawdust. I knew then that something had changed. Thanksgiving was supposed to be about family, about warmth, about love. But all I felt was betrayal. And as I sat there in silence, while everyone else ate and laughed, I made myself a promise. This would be the last Thanksgiving my grandson would ever spend out in the cold. Would you like me to now move to Chapter 2, the breaking point, and expand it in the same emotional, detailed way, continuing this exact tone and flow? The rest of that Thanksgiving felt like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. Every laugh, every clink of a wine glass felt like a hammer striking the same bruise in my chest. I barely touched my food. I watched the boy through the window, saw the way he hugged himself tighter as the shadows lengthened and the cold deepened. When the meal was finally over and the plates were being cleared, I couldn't stay quiet any longer. I stood up from my chair so suddenly that everyone stopped talking. My son looked up, startled. My daughter-in-law froze with a plate in her hand. "That boy is still outside," I said, my voice like gravel. "You've sat here for 2 hours eating, drinking, laughing, while a child shivered on the porch like a stray dog." My daughter-in-law sighed dramatically, as though I were the one ruining Thanksgiving. "Dad, you're overreacting." Overreacting. I took a step closer. My voice rose not in anger, but in something heavier, disappointment. "He is 8 years old." 8! What kind of family teaches a child a lesson by leaving him in the freezing cold? "It was just for a little while," my son muttered, but his voice was weak. "It was long enough," I said. "Long enough for him to wonder if anyone in this house actually cares about him. Long enough for me to wonder the same." The room went silent. No one met my eyes. I didn't wait for their approval. I went to the back door and opened it. The blast of icy air cut through the house. "Come inside, son," I said softly. My grandson looked up at me, teeth chattering. When he stepped into the kitchen, he stumbled, and I caught him, pulling him against me. His body was so cold it felt like holding a piece of winter itself. I wrapped him in my coat and guided him to the living room, away from the dining table, away from the laughter that had turned into uncomfortable silence. I gave him my plate of food, the only one I had touched just enough to make them think I'd eaten. He devoured it slowly, his small hands trembling as he lifted the fork. And I sat with him until he was warm. Later that night, when the house had quieted, I tucked him into bed myself. He looked up at me, eyes heavy with sleep, but full of something that crushed my heart. A mixture of gratitude and sadness that a child should never have to feel. "Grandpa," he whispered, "can we have Thanksgiving just us next time? You and me?" I brushed his hair back and kissed his forehead. "Yes," I said, my voice breaking. "Next time it will just be you and me, I promise." And I meant it. That night, I lay awake long after everyone had gone to bed. I stared at the ceiling and felt something burning inside me. Not anger exactly, but something stronger. I thought about every year I had sat at that table. Every year I had watched my son and his wife treat that boy as if he were a burden instead of a blessing. I thought about every careless word. Every time they had made him feel small, every time I had kept quiet, because I didn't want to start a fight. But I had reached my breaking point. Something inside me shifted, like an old door swinging open after years of being stuck. I wasn't just a guest in that house. I was a grandfather, and I would not be silent again. That night, while the house slept, I made a decision that would change everything. By the time next Thanksgiving came around, there would be no porch punishments, no cold shoulders, no hollow laughter over warm plates. Next year, there would be a table, but it would be ours. Next year, there would be warmth, but it would come from love, not just from fire. Next year, my grandson would know what family really meant. And next year, they would finally understand what they had lost. The house felt different after that Thanksgiving. Colder somehow, even when the fires were lit. My son and his wife acted as though nothing had happened, as though they hadn't left a child shivering outside while they feasted. But I carried that image with me everywhere. My grandson's small frame curled on the porch, the frost in his hair, the look in his eyes when he saw me standing inside. That night had planted a seed in me. And over the next months, that seed began to grow. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't make threats. I did something far quieter. I started planning. The year of preparation, I began by pulling back from the family. Where I once visited every weekend, I started coming less. I let their invitations pass unanswered. I stopped bringing them groceries, fixing their leaking pipes, and lending them money for emergencies. That never seemed to end. Instead, I spent my time with my grandson. I picked him up from school when I could. I taught him how to whittle wood in the evenings, how to fish on Saturday mornings, how to cook a simple meal. I told him stories from my youth, stories of when I was his age, and my own grandfather had been my anchor. And slowly, I watched the sadness lift from his eyes. He began to smile again, not the small, forced smiles he gave his parents when they were watching, but real smiles, bright and full of life. We started dreaming together. What if we had a little house just for us? He asked one afternoon as we sat by the river. What would it look like? I asked, hiding my own growing excitement. It would have a fireplace, he said, on a big table, and we'd have hot chocolate every night, and no one would yell. I smiled and squeezed his shoulder. That sounds like a perfect house. The cabin by spring. I sold a small piece of land I'd been sitting on for years. The money was enough to buy an old cabin a few towns over. Nothing fancy, but solid and warm. I spent the summer repairing it myself. I fixed the roof, painted the walls, replaced the old stove with a proper oven. I built shelves for books, carved a wooden rocking chair, and hung curtains in the windows. Every weekend I brought my grandson with me. We worked side by side, sanding, painting, laughing. I taught him how to drive a nail straight, how to build a fire safely. By autumn, the cabin looked like something out of a postcard, and by then I knew exactly what I would do. Thanksgiving comes again. When November rolled around, my son called, expecting us for dinner. Dad, don't be late, he said over the phone. Your grandson's punishment is behind us. We'll all have a nice meal this year. I smiled to myself, though he couldn't see it. We won't be coming? I said simply. There was a pause. What do you mean? Where are you going? Somewhere better, I said, and I hung up before he could argue. That morning, I drove with my grandson to the cabin. Snow had started to fall, dusting the pines in soft white. The air was cold but not cruel, and smoke curled from the chimney as we stepped inside. The table was already set. Just 2 plates, 2 mugs, and a small turkey roasting in the oven. The smell filled the entire room, rich and warm. Is this all for us? My grandson asked, eyes wide. All for us? I said. We sat by the fire while the turkey finished cooking. We laughed, told stories, and made silly faces at each other. When we finally ate, we didn't just eat. We celebrated. We gave thanks for each other, for the roof over our heads, for the warmth of the fire. For the first time in years, I felt full. Not just in my stomach, but in my heart. The silence they felt back at the old house, I knew the silence would be deafening. They would sit at that long table, glance at my empty chair, glance at my grandson's empty chair, and realize they had no one to blame but themselves. They would taste their turkey and feel it turn to ashes in their mouths, because the person they had left out in the cold last year was gone. Not just physically, but gone from their control, gone from their cruelty. This was my revenge. Not loud, not cruel, just a quiet removal of everything they took for granted. That night, after we'd cleaned the table, my grandson sat with me by the fire. This was the best Thanksgiving ever, he said softly. I smiled and held him close. And it's just the beginning. Because I knew then, I wasn't just taking one holiday back. I was taking his whole childhood back. The morning after our Thanksgiving in the cabin, I sat by the fire with a pen and a thick piece of paper. The boy was still asleep, wrapped in a quilt on the couch, his face peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in years. I began to write, not out of anger. I had let that go the night they left him shivering on the porch, but out of clarity, out of the need to make sure they understood why things would never be the same. The letter I wrote slowly, carefully, each word chosen like I was laying bricks for the last wall I would ever build between myself and them. You probably sat around your table yesterday and wondered where we were. You probably told yourselves I was being dramatic, that I was trying to punish you. But that's not what this is. This is about a boy you sent outside last Thanksgiving when the air was so cold it cut like a knife. You sat in your warm house and ate a feast while he sat on the porch shivering. You called it discipline. I call it cruelty. That was the day I realized this house was no longer a home. Not for him. Not for me. So I built a new one. A place where he is safe. A place where he is loved. You will not hear from me again. Not next Thanksgiving, not the one after that. You had your chance to teach him kindness, to teach him family. You taught him fear instead, and I will spend the rest of my life teaching him something better." I folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and mailed it that afternoon. Their silence a few days later, my phone rang, my son's number. I let it go to voicemail. Then came a message, "Dad, we got your letter. Please, just talk to us. The boy is our son. We deserve a chance to make this right." I stared at the phone for a long time before turning it face down. They deserved a chance last year. They deserved a chance every year before that. Every time they dismissed his tears, every time they made him feel small. But this silence, this was the only lesson they would understand. A new tradition, that evening, as snow fell gently outside the cabin, I cooked my grandson's favorite soup. We ate by the fire, the room glowing in warm light. After dinner, we carved a piece of wood together. A new tradition we had started that summer. We each wrote a word on it that described what we were thankful for. He wrote, "safe." I wrote, "free." We placed the wood on the mantel, where it would stay until next year, a reminder of what we had built together. The family's realization weeks later, I heard from a cousin that my son and his wife had stopped hosting Thanksgiving altogether. They couldn't bear to sit at the table with that empty chair staring back at them. Maybe one day they would truly understand what they had lost. Maybe one day they would change. But whether they did or didn't no longer mattered. Because in that quiet cabin, with the fire crackling and my grandson's laughter filling the room, I realized we had already won. The final image that night, before we went to bed, my grandson hugged me tighter than he ever had before. "Grandpa," he whispered, "I don't miss them." I kissed his hair and smiled. "Me neither, son, me neither." Outside, the snow kept falling soft and endless, covering the world in white. Inside, the fire kept burning. Inside, we were warm. And inside me, there was no more anger, just a quiet, steady peace.